Well, hello everyone, and welcome back. It's been a long time since the last Fit Across Cultures podcast. I feel it's been forever, but it's really only been 6 months, and I'm super excited to be back with a lovely guest, Pasha Cook. For those of you that are new to this show, this is actually episode 45, so you're going to have a lot of catching up to do. But for those of you that have listened before, you know the concept. We're interviewing professionals that are working with professional athletes or athletes themselves. And in this particular case, it's actually both, because Pasha used to be a collegiate athlete and played semi-professionally before ending her career, and we'll be talking about this in a minute. And now she's working with athletes and helping them in their transition process, developing leadership skills, and helping them with their branding as well, right?
Absolutely.
Well, thanks, Pasha, for being on the show. I'm very excited. Pasha was also one of the speakers at the Athlete Blab Summit in March. So for people that want to check that out, it's on YouTube and on blab.im. And you can just Google Athlete Blab, one word, and you'll find more information. But Pasha, why don't we start out by you giving us a quick intro of how you got to where you are now, because you're in lovely New York, right?
Yeah, I am in lovely New York. The sun has finally come out, so we're excited about that. Yeah. My journey started as a 24-year-old who got her first scholarship at that age. And eventually I transitioned out of sports after graduating from University of Memphis. But I was trying out for the WNBA. I was working out, getting ready, prepared to try out for the WNBA, and tore my ACL. So I was forced to figure out after that, well, what's next for my life? It took me on this transition that was a decade of trying to figure out what's next.
Yeah, and that's a nightmare situation for many athletes, right? Having a career-ending injury is almost something nobody wants to talk about, because people are very suspicious, especially athletes, and don't want to jinx it, as they say, right? But how was that transition for you? I mean, having worked so much towards that, how did you feel emotionally realizing that that dream was not going to happen?
Oh, it was devastating. I mean, this is something I had played since I was 7 years old, and now in my 20s, it's over for me. And many athletes go through that, like you said. And so we're trying to figure out, well, what's next? What's the next passion? What's the next purpose? Yeah. And through that transition, I eventually moved to New York in 2013 as a fashion intern. Now that was, we'll talk about that a little bit later. As a fashion intern. And in 2014, I was invited to speak at the WNBA Draft. And I had never spoken before in public. So I was a little nervous, but in that moment, when I looked at their faces and they were welcoming and listening to everything, they hung on to every word that I said, I knew that this is where I was supposed to be. I was supposed to be encouraging and empowering other athletes in their transition.
Okay, so it was almost more by coincidence that you got to where you are now, would you say?
Yes, well, it was a lot of work, because I had to figure out, well, what was next. So I went through many phases of my career trying to figure out what was next. And as you probably already know, as an elite athlete, when we focus on something, we're going to excel at that. Doesn't mean you have a passion for it, but the attributes that you gain as an athlete strengthen you. So when you go into a field, you're going to focus, you're going to be determined, you're going to finish. Yeah. And so I was in all these fields that I didn't have a passion for, but I was excelling.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the major problems, right? We have all these skills and we have been honed to be disciplined and focused. So we have a lot of very useful abilities, but you need to find something to focus on, right? And that's obviously one of the hurdles. So I think what's interesting when we're speaking about, the transition process and figuring out what to do with yourself, people always get stuck at this intersection of, well, I have all these great qualities, but sport has been everything for me, right? And what am I going to do next? So I think it's always great to give examples. So you said that you started out as a fashion intern, or so how did you come about? What was your step? What would you advise others from your own personal experience?
Well, I had a passion for fashion. The passion wasn't as great as I had for basketball, but it was something I was passionate about. I think that the way that you look on the outside should reflect what you have on the inside.
Yeah.
So I went into this field, and as we said, like an elite athlete, I wanted to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So I wanted to challenge myself. And New York was it. I was living in Houston, Texas. So Houston, Texas, I needed to come here.
Yeah.
And I came here as an intern because I had to start at the bottom. And that's a challenge for athletes as well.
Yeah.
When you've been at the top of your success, you know, collegiate, semi-pro, for me, you have to start at the bottom. It's a humbling experience. But if you really want to figure out what that is, you're going to take that challenge, right?
Yeah.
So when I was invited to speak, I became a speaker, but it was still something bigger than me. I didn't know what it was. I just kept pushing and kept pushing. And I had to go back to what helped me to gain access as an elite athlete, those attributes. And I implemented those attributes and came up with Champs U. And so Champs U is a workbook, a workshop that we're creating to help athletes in intentional transitioning, identifying those attributes, identifying those transferable skills, and implementing those in a different career, if you would. They may go back into sports, but not as an active player. So we're helping to create that roadmap.
I love the word intentional, because oftentimes, I mean, transition will happen, whether you want it or not. Athletes, you know, you can't just close your eyes. It's never going to happen. So the word intentional is great because it means that you're, you know, intentionally focused on it, hopefully before the day happens of where you hanging up your cleats or shoes or whatever it is sport that you're playing, right? So where can people find out more information about that and reach you if they want to hear more about this concept?
So they can reach me on my website, which is pashacook.com, PASHACOOK. You can reach me on Instagram, Twitter, Pasha Cook. If you Google Pasha Cook, you will find me, and I'll be looking for your emails.
Awesome. That's some good search engine optimization. Or is that just such an uncommon name that you're really lucky?
I'm really lucky. I call it blessed. I'm really blessed to have that name. So if you Google me, you'll find all of my information. So it's exciting that I don't have to compete with anybody else for that.
It's the same with me. My name is so rare that, you know, it's the same blessing. But going back to, you know, you starting out and realizing the speaking was something that you were passionate about and really helping athletes transform. It's really a transformation, right? To going from sort of being reactive to being proactive about it. Were there networks or people or mentors that you reached out to or that you tapped to make that transition for yourself happen?
First, I reached out to my family, which they didn't really understand a lot that was going on because I was moving to New York. But people in the league, I have some friends at the WNBA, so I networked while I was there. And that's very vital and important for athletes to understand. Networking. You may have to grow your circle. You may not have it when you come out of college, but they teach you how to network and to grow your inner circle. So that's what I did. And a lot of people stepped up and wanted to help me, people who were already doing it, and they gave me advice. But ultimately, I made the decision to bring my authenticity to my work and create Champs U the way that I saw fit, if that makes sense, because of my experience.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that transitions very well in what I wanted to talk next, and that how important is branding. I mean, you talk a lot about branding, and you just, you know, drop the word authenticity, which often comes up in branding, and especially with athletes who are often told that, oh, don't do that on social media, don't do this. I think they're a little bit afraid to show their real selves. And then, you know, when you're networking, you're always aware of the club or the association you're representing. So how important is branding for the transition process and beginning a career after your career?
It's very important. It's no longer the days where you're not a brand. If you had looked maybe 10, 15 years ago, then we probably wouldn't be having this conversation around social media branding. But now that everyone has access to social media. You are a brand. You're a brand, number one, for the organization, and you're a brand for yourself as you transition out. So one of the key components that I like to bring up when I talk to athletes is, if someone that you wanted to do business with, a company you wanted to work for, people that you wanted to engage, they looked at your social media, some people have it private, if it were open, what would they see? And what do you want them to see? So when you think about those two things, that should help you direct what you're going to put up on social media. And your story and who you are is your authenticity and your uniqueness. So you want to bring you to the table.
So you're staying authentic, you're merely filtering which part of it is that the public should know about, right? You're not faking it. You're not pretending to be somebody else, because that obviously, once you start a career that is different from being a professional athlete or working in professional sports circles, you cannot keep that up for very long, because you'll establish a reputation, you'll be perceived in a certain way, and I think there'll be a big backlash if you start out by not being authentic. So it's a good advice.
And and that's the thing. You can only fake it for so long.
Yeah.
Then you won't have a passion around what you're doing, because you're always trying to put on this facade. So you need to bring you, but you also need to study the industry in which you're interested in. And do you fit? Do your values fit into that industry? So we also at Champs U do a values exercise and a strengths exercise to identify your strengths and your attributes, and also the things that you value. And that helps you to create that roadmap, whether it's through branding or into another industry.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I'm all for self-awareness as like the first step to figuring out what you want to do and the vision you want to create for your future. Because I think oftentimes, and especially as an athlete, there's many people that have an opinion about you, and that there's a lot of pressures. There's a lot of could start with family and friends that think you should be doing something specific that you might not feel like, but because you've been following other people's advice for so long, from coaches and athletic staff, it's very natural to sort of follow that when you're discovering your other passions, right? So I think it's really important to step a bit back and almost have a moment of self-reflection, very, very intentionally, before you head into the next big adventure, right? I think oftentimes there's a lot of investors or interested people that kind of want to gauge your interest and lure you into a certain industry. But I think it's very important what you said about, figuring out where you fit in, and also figuring out which of these pressures do you want to adhere to, and which of these pressures, do you need to stop worrying about.
Absolutely. And I think that's why it's very vital that we start early before we transition out, so that that intention and that focus is something that you can grow while you're still playing.
Yeah.
And also, again, growing your network, growing your accountability team. That's very important too, because as an athlete, you're directed by the coach, the trainer, the professors, whoever, all these other people who are directing you while you're in school. You have to be here at this specific time, be there at this specific time. Well, you need to have people also that are outside of the school that you need to network that are going to help to hold you accountable as well.
Yeah. So having a network outside of the sports is really important. Definitely.
Absolutely.
Would you, having had the experience of working with different athletes, would you say there are differences in the challenges of transition depending on gender and race, for example? Is there a difference in the challenges, let's say, female African-American athletes perceive as opposed to white males? And I'm asking this question, setting you up, obviously, for that, thinking there's a difference.
I see you're setting me up. You've already set it up. I believe that there is. I believe there is. With the African-American culture, most of the time, and we'll talk about men briefly, African-American male, most of the sports that they're in, football and basketball, right? The ones that generate the most income for these institutions and for the leagues. Yeah. And many times you're that athlete, you're that source to help your family get out of the conditions that they are in, you know, the environment that they're in. So you're the success story, and it's a lot of pressure on you. So most of the time, those guys are only focused on the sport and getting better so they can become professional athletes. But what happens if you get an injury your sophomore year? It's devastating. White male, I feel like many of them come from a different background. They may have more personal development, have other options. Their family have trained them to understand that you have other options besides being an athlete. Females tend to graduate at a higher rate. They tend to find jobs, especially females who have played sport, tend to do very well once they transition out of sport. I was a first generation college graduate, so it was different for me as well. And I wanted to become that success story for my family and leave my legacy. And that's what I'm doing now.
Perfect. And, you know, all the respect for it. And I think the reason I ask this is that oftentimes we receive this blanket advice, right? So here are the 5 things to do for transitioning athletes. And that's a great start. But I think essentially you need to look at the background of the specific athletes to give targeted advice, right?
Absolutely.
You know, the story of someone as a first generation African-American collegiate athlete is going to be very different in focusing on their career after their career than, you know, I don't know, a white male player whose father already played in the NBA and who has a huge network, and, you know, there's a financial understanding on investment and that sort of thing. So I'm not saying that only one of these needs transition help. I think there is room for all of them to be better at transitioning. But we need to keep that diversity and difference in mind when we're talking about this. So definitely. I mean, I was the first one in my family to go to college, and just, you know, remembering the frustrations of not being able to talk to someone about, you know, your current situation or what you were facing in terms of job searches and decisions that you had to make can be challenging in a different way than somebody that has a huge network of university alumni.
Right. You feel like you're left alone.
Yeah.
You go from this family environment with other athletes to now it's all up to you. Right. Yeah. And for Champs U, what we're doing here is also focusing in on the female athlete and females in general. So, because we have a different story, and I don't see a lot of people out there targeting the female athletes, because when you read the headlines, all you see is male athletes gets in trouble, domestic violence, goes from $100 million to broke. Well, what female athlete you know makes $100 million besides maybe Serena?
To start with, exactly.
Right. So our story is different. So for me, it's taking my experience and cherry picking those attributes and those things that I've learned as an educator and an entrepreneur, and helping the female to own their power and to champion change, because change is inevitable. Yeah. But how do you get through it, and how do you have intention in your change so that you can be successful regardless of what happens in your life?
Definitely. And I like that you hone in on where, you know, you obviously also have the credibility, right, to speak to female athletes, because that's exactly, you know, it's a perfect target audience, I think. And I mean, I work a lot with, you know, the whole diversity approach in corporate organizations as well. And their gender is always a big issue. So that's something female athletes already face before they're entering a business environment. So it's really good to keep on educating and pushing them to, you know, break that ceiling. Coming back to the transition process as such, we already touched on a few things: having a mentor and a network outside of sports, starting early, not when you're about to retire, but really thinking about this as a long-term project that has to take up some of your time while you're already playing. What other things would you say are universal for athletes, female athletes, to look at when they're looking at their transition and retirement plans?
The universal thing is, where do you see yourself? The perception you have about yourself, what your strengths are, and providing the direction for them. So with Champs U, I know I've plug this thing so many times, but it's just my baby, it's my passion.
Yeah.
With you, we help them to identify those things, and we have that conversation with them. Mm-hmm. And once we're able to do that, they can move on and move forward with their own roadmap and action plans. We're just equipping them with the tools to help guide them better. Because if you don't know what your values are, if you haven't identified what you value now versus what you value when you first started playing basketball or whatever sport you're in, then it's very confusing. So we just take the confusion out of transition, mm-hmm. and then give you an action. Okay, well, what are you going to do now? What is your plan now? You are equipped. It's your decision at this point.
Yeah. And I'm sure that takes a lot of fear away as well, right? Because, staring at this big fat nothing is scary. So just by having, an outline of that you still have to fill yourself because it's about you. But having a roadmap or some sort of structure, I think takes a lot of that fear away.
Absolutely. And when I share my story, because many times they see me coming in and I dress down a little bit with the athletes, but I still wear a suit all the time. Mm-hmm. And they see this polished female entrepreneur who is successful. And when I start to share how I got there, that helps them to take the fear off as well. Like, what? You went through that and that. And we'll be launching my book. My book will be published in September. It's called mm-hmm. Unrepeatable Miracle. It tells all the struggles that I endured as an athlete, as an African-American woman, but also how I was able to turn those into my strengths and get to where I am right now. And it took a village. It took principals, coaches, other females, male, many, many people, but it was just about focusing on who you are, the authenticity, your strengths, and where you wanted to go. Mm-hmm. And through any struggle, we can get through it if we have just some direction and some support.
Definitely. And that could almost be a closing statement right there. I just want to talk a little bit about mindset because, yes, athletes do have a winning mindset in sports, but not always does that translate into other areas because maybe you don't have the confidence that you had from a sports environment where you've trained from an early age, right? And this was all that you were, that was your identity. And now you have to establish a new identity. And that shift of mindset of, seeing the opportunity in an adverse situation, in a situation where you're not the top, I think is difficult. Do you have any advice for athletes that are struggling with that, where it's really, they have the capabilities, they know, like here, they know it, but here, and for those that are listening, I'm pointing at my brain, but in the heart, they're not convinced. They're not convinced about themselves that they can do it.
You have to hone in on what got you to where you are. There are things within you, right? Your inner power. There are things that you're very good at. Hone in on those things and add your passion to that. Apply your passion to that. And that's where you get to where you want to go. Athletes go through athletic identity, many of us, because we started so young. And so we primarily identify with the athlete in us. Well, that athlete in you can do anything. And that's what I talk to women about. Like, you can do you got to this level? Yeah. How many people get to this level? How many people get to college playing sport? Right? A very small percentage, and an even smaller percentage go pro. So if you got to these two levels of your career, then you can do anything. And so we do help them to build that confidence by telling them that your uniqueness is the fingerprint that you need to leave on life, because no one will ever be able to take your place. You are an unrepeatable miracle. And so hone in on that champion that's inside of you and apply that to the thing that you're passionate about outside of sport. What do you love to do that you just, besides sport, right? Because you're not actively playing it. Even if it is sport, you may want to be a broadcaster, right? A color commentator, write articles, do interviews, create a podcast, consult other athletes. So you can still stay in sport, but you got to bring something else to that. You got to bring the other side of you into that field.
I love that The uniqueness is the footprint you want to leave in the world. Absolutely amazing. Pasha Cook, it was a pleasure having you. This is going to be episode 45 for everybody listening on, iTunes, Stitcher, whatever your podcast catcher is. And you can find more information at fitacrosscultures.com/episode 45. Thanks, Pasha.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.